Genesis 48 to 49. Matthew 14, Genesis 48 to 49. These chapters detail Jacob blessing his sons. In Genesis 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, giving them a special inheritance. In Genesis 49, Jacob gives prophetic blessings to each of his 12 sons, which reflect their future tribes' destinies. Matthew 14. This chapter narrates several significant events in Jesus' ministry. It includes the story of John the Baptist's execution, Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus walking on water to reach his disciples during a storm. Genesis 50, Exodus 1 to 2, Matthew 15, Genesis 50. This chapter describes the death and burial of Jacob. After Jacob's passing, Joseph mourns and arranges for his father's burial in the land of Canaan, as Jacob had requested. The chapter concludes with Joseph reassuring his brothers of his forgiveness and God's plan, followed by Joseph's death at the age of 110. Exodus 1 through 2. Exodus 1 recounts the oppression of the Israelites in Egypt. A new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, rose to power and enslaved the Israelites, fearing their growing numbers. Despite the harsh conditions, the Israelites continued to multiply. Exodus 2 introduces the birth of Moses. His mother hides him for 3 months and then sets him adrift in a basket on the Nile River, where Pharaoh's daughter finds and adopts him. Moses grows up in the Egyptian court, but flees to Midian after killing an Egyptian taskmaster. In Midian, he marries Zipporah and begins a new life as a shepherd. Matthew 15. This chapter includes several important teachings and miracles of Jesus. It begins with Jesus addressing the Pharisees and teachers of the law about the importance of inner purity over ritual cleanliness. It then recounts the faith of a Canaanite woman who seeks healing for her daughter, and concludes with the miraculous feeding of the 4,000 with 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. Exodus 3:4. He encounters the burning bush on Mount Horeb, where God calls to him and reveals himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God tells Moses that he has heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt and has chosen Moses to lead them out of slavery. Moses is hesitant and questions his ability, but God reassures him and gives him signs to perform, such as turning his staff into a serpent and making his hand leprous, and then healed. God also reveals his name to Moses as I am who I am, Yahweh. Exodus 4: Moses continues to express his doubts, worried that the Israelites will not believe him. God provides more signs, including turning water from the Nile into blood. Moses still feels inadequate because of his speech, so God appoints his brother Aaron as his spokesman. Moses returns to Egypt with his family and meets Aaron, sharing God's message and performing the signs before the Israelite elders, who believe and worship God. The chapter ends with Moses and Aaron preparing to confront Pharaoh to demand the release of the Israelites. These chapters mark the beginning of Moses' mission to liberate the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, setting the stage for the dramatic events that follow. X 5-7, Matt 16. X 5-7, Matt 16. Sure thing. Here's a summary of Exodus 5-7 and Matthew 16. Exodus 5-7. Exodus 5. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. Pharaoh refuses and increases the workload of the Israelite slaves, making their lives even harder. The Israelites complain to Moses and Aaron, who then turn to God for help. Exodus 6. God reassures Moses, promising deliverance for the Israelites. He reaffirms his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and assures Moses that he will lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Despite these reassurances, the Israelites struggle to believe Moses because of their harsh labor and suffering. Exodus 7. God instructs Moses and Aaron on what to do when they approach Pharaoh again. Aaron's staff turns into a serpent, but Pharaoh's magicians replicate the miracle with their staffs. God then sends the first of the 10 plagues, turning the Nile River into blood, which Pharaoh's magicians also imitate. Pharaoh remains stubborn and refuses to let the Israelites go. Matthew 16. This chapter includes several key events and teachings of Jesus. The Pharisees and Sadducees demand a sign from Jesus, but he rebukes them for their lack of faith. Jesus warns his disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, referring to their teachings. Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus praises Peter and declares that on this rock he will build his church. Jesus predicts his death for the first time, explaining that he must suffer, be killed, and be raised on the 3rd day. Peter rebukes him, but Jesus responds by telling Peter that he is setting his mind on human things rather than on divine things. Jesus teaches about the cost of discipleship, emphasizing the need to take up one's cross and follow him. These chapters provide powerful narratives and lessons about faith, obedience, and God's plan for his people. Exodus 8-9. Matthew 17. The plagues include frogs. Frogs overrun the land, but Pharaoh's magicians replicate the miracle. Pharaoh promises to release the Israelites if the frogs are removed, but he changes his mind once the plague ends. Gnats. The dust becomes gnats, covering people and animals. Pharaoh's magicians cannot replicate this plague and acknowledge God's power, but Pharaoh remains stubborn. Flies. Swarms of flies invade Egypt, but not the land of Goshen where the Israelites live. Pharaoh temporarily relents, but once the flies are gone, he hardens his heart again. Exodus 9. More plagues continue. Livestock. A severe plague kills the Egyptian livestock, but spares the Israelite animals. Boils. Boils and sores break out on the Egyptians and their animals. Pharaoh's magicians cannot stand before Moses because of the boils. Hail. God sends a devastating hailstorm, destroying crops and livestock in the fields. Pharaoh admits his sin and promises to let the Israelites go, but hardens his heart again once the hail stops. Matthew 17. This chapter includes several important events in Jesus' ministry. The Transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. Jesus is transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun and his clothes becoming white as light. Moses and Elijah appear, talking with Jesus. God's voice from a bright cloud affirms Jesus as his beloved Son. Healing a demon-possessed boy. When they come down from the mountain, Jesus heals a boy possessed by a demon that the disciples could not cast out. He explains that their lack of faith was the reason. Jesus predicts his death again. Jesus tells his disciples that he will be betrayed, killed, and raised on the 3rd day. The temple tax. Jesus instructs Peter to catch a fish, and in its mouth he will find a coin to pay the temple tax for both of them. These chapters reveal the power, authority, and compassion of God through his acts and miracles. Exodus 10-11. Matthew 18. Exodus 10-11. Exodus 10. God sends the 8th and 9th plagues on Egypt. Locusts. Moses warns Pharaoh about the coming plague of locusts. Despite his servants urging him to release the Israelites, Pharaoh refuses. The locusts descend, devouring every plant and tree left after the hail. Pharaoh once again asks for forgiveness, but after the locusts are removed, he hardens his heart. Darkness. The 9th plague is 3 days of total darkness over Egypt, so intense that people could not see each other or move. Despite the severity, Pharaoh's heart remains hardened, though he attempts to negotiate by keeping the Israelite livestock. Moses insists on full freedom for the Israelites. Exodus 11. God announces the final and most devastating plague, the death of all the firstborn in Egypt. Moses delivers the message to Pharaoh, declaring that this plague will compel Pharaoh to release the Israelites. The chapter ends with Pharaoh's heart hardened, setting the stage for the final judgment. Matthew 18. This chapter contains several teachings and parables of Jesus, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus emphasizes the need for humility by using a child as an example. He teaches that those who become like children are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Causing to stumble. Jesus warns against causing others, especially children, to stumble in their faith. He uses strong language to emphasize the severity of leading others into sin. The parable of the lost sheep. Jesus shares a parable about a shepherd who leaves 99 sheep to find one that is lost. He illustrates God's care and concern for every individual. Dealing with sin in the church. Jesus gives instructions on how to address sin among believers, emphasizing the importance of reconciliation and forgiveness. The parable of the unmerciful servant. Jesus tells a parable about a servant who is forgiven a massive debt by his master, but then refuses to forgive a fellow servant's small debt. The master punishes the unmerciful servant, and Jesus concludes with a lesson on the necessity of forgiving others. These chapters illustrate the dramatic events leading up to the Exodus and Jesus' profound teachings on humility, forgiveness, and compassion. Act 12. Exodus 12 is a pivotal chapter in the story of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Here's a summary of the key events. The Passover. God instructs Moses and Aaron to establish the Passover, which marks the beginning of a new calendar for the Israelites. Each household is to select a lamb without defect, slaughter it, and use its blood to mark the doorposts and lintels of their homes. They are to roast the lamb and eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. This meal is to be eaten in haste, with the people dressed and ready to leave. The plague of the firstborn. That night, the Lord passes through Egypt and strikes down all the firstborn, both human and animal, in the land of Egypt. However, he passes over the houses marked with lamb's blood, sparing the Israelites. The Exodus. Pharaoh finally relents and orders the Israelites to leave Egypt. The Israelites, numbering about 600,000 men plus women and children, depart in haste, taking with them their unleavened dough. They also take silver, gold, and clothing from the Egyptians, who give these items willingly. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. God commands the Israelites to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days each year as a lasting ordinance. This commemorates their hasty departure from Egypt and the liberation from slavery. Further instructions. Moses gives further instructions about the Passover and its significance. He emphasizes the importance of teaching future generations about God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. This chapter lays the foundation for one of the most significant events in Jewish history and is rich with symbolism and meaning.